Hello, this is Peter Landau, managing editor for newsjunkie.net. And with me today is Joe Sacco, who needs no introduction, but I'm going to ask him for one anyway. Joe?
Okay. I'm a cartoonist. I'm probably most known for my journalism work, but I call myself a cartoonist because I don't want to be restricted to just journalism.
But you followed a traditional path to journalism and ended up working in a unique corner of it.
Yeah, I wanted to be a hard news writer. I wanted to write for a newspaper, and that just didn't pan out. So I fell back on what I'd been doing since I was a kid, which is drawing. I mean, it's kind of a process. It took a few years, but at some point, I was living in Berlin doing rock and roll posters, album covers, trying to work on my own sort of satirical comics. Um, but then I got interested in the Middle East and I wanted to go and see for myself what was going on and talk to people. I wasn't exactly sure how to go about it or what I was going to do, but I launched myself there. And perhaps I thought of it as a bit like a travelogue. Coming out of the autobiographical tradition of comics, I thought, "Oh, these are Joe's experiences in the West Bank or whatever it is." Um, but when I got there, that journalism training that I'd had at the University of Oregon just kicked in. I started interviewing people, looking at the facets of the occupation, trying to piece together a more or less complete picture of what was going on. And so it sort of became journalistic because of what I'd been trained to do. It wasn't like I set out to do journalism comics in a sort of hard way. I mean, you can sort of see I'm experimenting in that first book that's called Palestine. But yeah, it ended up being journalism without a theory and just cobbling together, you know, um, these stories. As time went by, yeah, I mean, my subsequent books were more self-consciously journalistic.
Those first comic books under the Palestine title were published by Fantagraphics. Were they your first choice, or did you try to go through a more like traditional news publication?
It wasn't even a choice in a certain sense because they had published a comic series I did called Yahoo. And I was thinking of self-publishing. Back in those days, some cartoonists had sort of branched out to try to self-publish. It wasn't my first choice, but I didn't think anyone was going to be interested in comics about Palestine. But I was at a party in Seattle speaking to Kim Thompson and Gary Groth, who co-published of Fantagraphics. And I mentioned what I was going to try to do, and I remember Kim Thompson saying, "Oh, we'll print it. We'll publish it." Like just out of the blue. I actually didn't expect that. But he immediately just responded that way, and they stuck with it. Fantagraphics stuck with it, even though the sales of those nine comics, because it was a nine comic book series, the sales just kept going down. Over each issue, they were a little more pathetic. So by the last issue, I don't think that in North America I sold more than 1,500 copies. You know, by all rights, they should have canceled it, but they didn't. They stuck with it. So I'll always be thankful to them for that.
Well, comics journalism, though it does have a history, it doesn't seem that common today. Um, were you familiar with the history of comics journalism before you got into this?
Not really. I didn't really know much about it. I wasn't really even aware of what Harper's Magazine had done in the Civil War when they sent illustrators out. I wasn't really aware of the Illustrated London News, but obviously there were people who thought of this sort of thing before me. I wasn't even sure what I was doing. I wasn't looking for examples of what to do. But clearly this is not my invention.
So, which came first, like your love of journalism or comics?
I was reading comics since I was a kid, but I never thought of them as a revenue stream, if you know what I mean. I was drawing comics all the time. I loved it, but it wasn't really in my mind to make a living out of it because I didn't see any avenues for it. My first love was, in a way, if you could say love, was journalism because I remember being on the high school newspaper and every time a foreign exchange student came in, I would interview them. I liked that. I liked talking to people. I realized you had an in with people if you said you were going to write a story about them. And suddenly they're talking to you and you're getting to know this person. I just like that that sense. It was almost like a light bulb went off in my head. It was about 11th grade. I thought, this is exactly what I want to do. So, in a way, I was very impelled to be a writer, to be a hard-nosed sort of
Mhm.
reporter. I wanted to report the facts, if you know what I mean. I wasn't really interested in features and more in just in news. But that just didn't pan out.
If I remember, your influences in journalism were not necessarily those breaking news reporters, right? You said you were interested in the new journalists.
Well, I mean, in high school, I was interested in just hard news, hard-nosed reporting. But in college, I began to discover authors like Michael Herr, who wrote a book called Dispatches about the Vietnam War, and Hunter S. Thompson, particularly the book Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail. And those really sort of twisted me around and made me think, oh, you can write this sort of stuff and just be funny or entertaining or whatever it is. But I think most of what I got from authors like that was a real sense of what was going on. I suppose I couldn't put my finger on it exactly, but you felt what it was like to be on the campaign trail. You weren't just getting a bunch of stories. They weren't just interviews, but it was his opinion about what was going on. He had a
Mhm.
great line about, I think it was Edwin Muskie. I can't remember the name of the candidate exactly.
Right.
He was
Yes.
running, and I think Hunter S. Thompson said something about how he had a campaign speech. In the afternoon, he had a campaign speech and it was bullshit. And in the evening, he gave the same speech and it was bullshit with gravy. And I love that. It sort of summed up like, no, this is all rubbish. These people are rubbish. And you're just going to say it. And I love that feeling. And from Michael Herr from Dispatches, I got a sense of what it was like to be sort of in Vietnam. He gave me a sense of what the soldiers were going through. It almost felt like I could smell the cordite in the air. And I think when I started doing comics journalism, you can sort of see it in Palestine. I'm trying to be very visceral. Let's just say that. I'm trying to make it feel like it's coming from the gut.
Um, are there younger cartoonists that you see following in your footsteps and taking the cartoon medium and using it as a way to tell a journalistic story?
Yeah, I think there are younger cartoonists. I mean, there are people like Sarah Glidden. There's there's some people in Latin America, people in France that are doing this sort of thing. I think a lot of people are doing this sort of thing now, and I think what's kind of nice is that there are no real rules yet that are going to petrify how to go about doing it. And I think what always makes it fresh is you can really never have two cartoonists depicting something in quite the same way. So just by the nature of the drawn image, you're going to get a very different viewpoint, even if they're reporting on exactly the same thing at exactly the same time.
No, cartoons there's like this perennial story in the mainstream press with the headline cartoons, comma, they're not for kids anymore. And the fact that it keeps on repeating means that it hasn't really locked in. Like I know in Europe and Japan and other countries, cartoonists are more for adults as well as for young people. Now it's more so now. But do you think the work that you're doing and the other cartoonists you mentioned are going to give it a broader sort of footprint in our culture?
Yeah, I think so. I guess that whole line about cartoonists, pow wow wham bam, they're not just for kids anymore. I think that was sort of put to bed, or I hope it was. I mean, to me, Art Spiegelman settled that argument, if you know what I
Mhm.
mean. But I do think cartoon journalists can be taken seriously. I know my own work is taken seriously. I think it's taken seriously as journalism. I know that there are still some holdouts or people who are going to sneer at anything, but at something like that. But I think those are people who just sneer at the popular culture in general.
And the younger generation can speak to my own kids who are getting their news from alternative sources, online influencers, streamers. Um, do you think you can build a bridge to a younger generation because they may be more open to cartoons as a medium that can be serious?
Yeah, I think so. I think in general, any sort of alternative form is going to appeal to younger people these days. I mean, I think the mainstream press has lost a lot of credibility. Um, they seem to fill the air with talking heads rather than reporting because reporting is expensive. You actually have to
Mhm.
have someone in the field somewhere, and that's more of a rare thing. You see more reporting by people who don't have a big budget but are just going to go anyway. I think younger people are gravitating toward those things. I think comics and comics journalism is just part of that, part of what is appealing to them now.
I don't want to leave you without talking about your new book, The Once and Future Riot. It almost reads like an example of the Rashomon effect, with the Muslims and the Hindus seeing an event from two different points of view. Is that your intention in writing it, or it's a story that occurred what, about 10 years ago?
Well, I was curious to see what people would say about what happened during this period of rioting in Uttar Pradesh state in 2013. I went there about a year afterward. I was interested in what narratives they would come up with. So I don't think I would have been so interested in the story if it was just a matter of, reporting on like, well, this is what happened, and then this happened, and this happened. I was more interested in what the stories would be about what happened. I mean, I'm trying to look for different approaches to the journalism I'm doing. So I wasn't setting out necessarily to have this Rashomon effect. I was just curious about what they were going to say. And it turns out to be as you described it. I found that both sides were tailoring their stories to suit themselves and obviously to protect themselves. But you have to go beyond just showing or just like demonstrating that something is fishy. You actually have to prove it's not correct. So I would put those stories I was being told next to what factually happened. I mean, you have to do reporting, not just rely on, oh well, this side says this and this side says that, and now I'm going to leave it alone. It's okay, but what actually happened? How close are these two sides to describing events as they actually took place? That was an intriguing idea for me.
And you're known for these very serious political cartoons, but like you said, you started doing more satirical work or illustration work. You have said that you want to go back to that humorous work. Are you doing anything like in that regards? Any slapstick coming from you in the future?
Yeah, I'm working now on my Rolling Stones book, which has been in the works for more than a decade. It was
Mhm.
always my Saturday project. Every now and then I had to stop working on it when I had to get serious about finishing a piece of journalism. It's really been necessary for me to work on something like this just for myself because I'm kind of, I hate the expression in a way, but burned out on journalism and burned out on how the world is. Though I got to say, the Stones book is really about the world as it is, but through a completely different prism, the prism of satire, humor. There's a lot of serious material in there, but it's all refracted.
Can you tell me what it's about, or is that under wraps until publishing date?
It's hard to describe. I would say it's like a complete synthesis of Western thought and civilization in an easy to read comic book.
So nothing ambitious. That's good.
It is kind of ambitious, but yeah.
You've been generous with your time, and I'm going to give you one last question
Okay.
because even though you are working on a ambitious humor book about the Rolling Stones, politics do keep bringing you back, and you're working on another collaboration with the journalist Chris Hedges, A Return to Gaza. And it's coming out, I believe, in the fall. And you both have a history in that region, and the genocide must be especially hard on you both. So I'm just curious, is that the genesis for the book? What's currently going on in Israel?
Yeah, it's called Requiem for Gaza.
Oh, I'm sorry about
No,
that.
it's okay. That's okay. Um, and it's finished now. We're in the stage of choosing the cover, that kind of thing. I spent a lot of time in Gaza and spent a lot of years working on books about the Palestinians. And Chris was New York Times bureau chief in the Middle East. and he knows the region well. We did a magazine piece for Harper's back in the early 2000s about a town of Han Yunis in Gaza. We both have a lot of history with the place. So yes, when the genocide started, we were both appalled. And I think it's just a calling. You have to do something. Even though I actually wanted my career to start going in a completely different direction, there was no way around it. I have friends there. I knew the streets. You know, you can't, it's like you cannot just ignore your family, let's say. There are certain things you can't ignore. We were both basically called to the story. We both knew we had to do it. I think in my particular case, there was part of me that didn't want to do it just because I knew it was going to be very difficult, which it was. It
Mhm.
was. I mean, the stories are really harrowing and hard. It's hard to draw that stuff. It's hard to hear those stories, but they need to be told. They're told through the words of the Palestinians themselves. Absolutely necessary that there's a record of this sort of thing. And this is just the beginning, I think, of the records of these sorts of this sort of thing that will be coming out in the foreseeable future.
I just want to thank you for all the good work you do. And I'm looking forward to a respite from that with the more humorous or lighter stuff. And again, it's been great talking to you. Thank you.
You're welcome, Peter. It was a pleasure.